This is a little bit of but it'll make sense, I promise, when we talk about Isaiah 47 and 48. So Pastor Dinger in church today at 8:30, at the 8:30 service, and he might mention it again at 11, mentioned a book. And I want this on the record a little bit too, because it might be someplace that we head eventually once we get through Isaiah. And the book is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And I'll show you a picture on the screen in just a second. But I wanted to just give you an idea, if this helps whet your appetite or wet your whistle on what this book is about, and that's why I have the camera pointed this way too, I think this will be very helpful for you. So my question is, and this is the premise of his book, and he starts with this, and it could be many different things. He just chooses this because it's one of the most obvious examples. How is it that the phrase, "I am a man trapped in a woman's body," makes any sense? Like, why does that make sense to people? So in other words, if I walk down the street today, and I went to City Hall, and I went and lobbied for protections, why is it that statement makes any sense to people, right? What happened culturally? Because he says, in my grandfather's generation, if you would have said that to him, he would have looked at you like you had horns. Like, this does not make any sense. Like, they would have been like, this, you're not making sense to me right now. Are you crazy? Or do you have that's honestly what he said. Now people say it as if that's just a normal option. What happened culturally to get you there is the question that this book asks. So hence, the rise and the triumph of the modern self. And the idea is you can construct your own reality and you get authentic meaning from within. So he goes through some philosophy. He starts in the 1700s in particular with Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, gets to some of the Romantic poets, and then spends a lot of time on Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Charles Darwin, and who's my other one? Who's my last one? Marx, Freud, Darwin. I'll think of the other one in just a second. But he spent, No, he doesn't talk about him, surprisingly. But he talks about those guys, and his point in those is he kind of constructs these different streams of thought and how they all kind of come together to our moment, is his point. And so here's my question, and this is something that you'll kind of see, and I want to kind of show you this. And he uses sociologists, and he uses philosophers of religion and other groups. He uses different people. Charles Taylor, a famous Canadian philosopher, is somebody he references. A sociologist named Philip Reif he uses, and they're not even necessarily Christians, but they've talked about culture a little bit. And so there's a shift that's taking place. Okay, and the words that he uses, and I'll see. So he uses transcendent, and then he uses immanent. And he uses that spelling intentionally, and he explains why. And he uses transcendence and immanence, and he uses those terms. See if I can see those on the board a little bit. Yeah, I'll turn it a little bit and maybe scoot this over so people can see it a little better. Whoa, lost my whole camera. Let's try that again. All right, transcendent. So the idea was, so where do you find meaning? Okay, and this is actually in Isaiah. We'll see this when God says, I know who you are. I've called you by my name. Those sort of things. He makes comments like that. So in a transcendent culture, the idea is when it comes to the question of history. Okay, and this idea, there is a purpose, there is a design. Okay, there is a plan, there's a pattern. Okay, to history, and we would say whether it's God or the gods directs it. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's in a transcendent worldview. Okay, when it comes to identity, who are you? I mean, that's a really legitimate question. Who are you? Like, who are you? Are you, just a gob of meat? Are you a bunch of cells that just randomly got together, like in the secular version of the evolutionary paradigm? Like, who are you? Okay. But in the transcendent worldview, right, you would talk about things like the image of God, okay? Or we talk about, your new creation, you're in Christ, for example. But and it doesn't have to be Christian, though. Oops, I spelled that wrong here. It doesn't have to be Christian. It could be something like the gods in Greco-Roman culture, or it could even be fate. The fates. They talked about the fates. But in both of those cultures, there is this kind of sense that you get your meaning, you get your purpose, you get your sense of history, your sense of identity from outside of yourself. Is that fair enough, right? What happens is starting in the 1700s, especially here, it starts to become focused inward. So your meaning instead becomes about expression. Okay, and words like authentic. Okay, authenticity was, especially about 10, 15 years ago, that was a big buzzword in the church. We need to be authentic. Okay, that was a big, we don't talk about it like we used to. But the word authenticity, and I'm not saying we should be fake, okay, don't get me wrong on this, but there's a specific name for this. Individualism is the name of the game. Okay, now how does this work? And I'll show you, and I'm gonna try to do my best. This is a preview because I want to get to Isaiah. This is just a preview of what I'm reading, what Pastor Dinger is talking about in church, because he's reading this book too. And as he said, you kind of have to read the same page twice sometimes. There's a lot of stuff going on in this book. It's pretty thick. The earlier chapters, the later chapters are easier than the middle chapters. Okay, if that helps. And like I said, there's a video lecture series on this that I might use later anyways. But expression, authentic, and individualism. So here's how this works. If here you get your identity, if let's say you were raised in 13th century England, and they said, "Who are you?" You would have said, I'm from Sussex. My dad was a peasant, so I'm probably going to be a peasant. I'm a subject of the Baron whoever, who is also the feudal subject of King John. I am a Christian. I've been baptized. This is my village. This is my defense. That's who I am. That's what they would have said, right? This is the language that I speak. And if you notice in all those things, did that person choose any of that? No. That is all transcendent. It's something that's beyond them, or it's stuff that's been given to me. It's outside of them. They have not determined their identity. Their identity has been given to them. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's how now here's what people say. Who are you? Well, today I'm expressing myself as non-binary. Why? You see the difference? Because now meaning is found within myself. So in the book, the rise and triumph of the modern self, he traces all those strands of how we got there. How we go from, I'm this member of 12th century England where all these things are possible, right, where I have my identity. I'm an Englishman. I'm the subject of the king. I'm going to be a peasant. I've been baptized. I'm a Christian. I'm a man. I'm objectively all these things. I probably know who my wife was when I was 5 years old. Didn't know it yet, but I probably did, right? I know who my village is. I have a sense of belonging, history, all those things. We are now creating all of that within ourselves. And so what the book does, it shows you different strands of thought. And when you were in here a little bit earlier, Rochelle heard some of this already. So going back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he would say all of this stuff is keeping you down from being your true self. In other words, it's oppressing you. Now, he wouldn't have used the word oppression. So have you ever heard of the myth of the noble savage? Have you ever heard this idea before? The idea was before society's conventions, before civilization ruined us, we were in this kind of romantic state of idealism, this kind of utopia where, there was kind of, you didn't have to have like marriage and government and schools. You just kind of were able to be right next to nature and be your true self. Rousseau makes that kind of argument. And to be your authentic you need to cast off all of society's shackles so that you can be you. Does that sound familiar? That starts all the way back in the 1700s with Rousseau. He goes all the way back that far. Okay, now, like all ideas, especially intellectual ideas, it takes generations before it catches on, right? Outside of the intelligentista of France, nobody was reading Rousseau. Okay, right? No, so in other words, the average person at his plow, the average pastor, the average school teacher was not influenced by Rousseau in the 1700s, at least not much. Okay, but as time unfolds, it becomes more and more influential. You get into the 1800s, early 1900s, it becomes more influential. Okay, then so he talks about Rousseau. Then he also talks about the Romantics. So the Romantics in the 19th century are people that truly believe. Let's see what we got here. Oh, admit. The Romantics were a group of people who truly thought that, for example, that if I can express myself through art, especially poetry. Now, poetry isn't limited to poetry. It could be music. It could be sculpture. It could be great novels, right? Those sort of things. But we'll just use the word poetry for short, meaning the act of creating art. So for some of the great Romantic poets, because society has been ruined by the Industrial Revolution, or because society has been ruined by the Enlightenment, where everything's been turned into a machine. It's all about science now, right? There's no mystery in life. In order for me to be authentic, I need to create a new world in art, and I will bring you in. I am the artist as hero. The artist as hero. I will bring you into new worlds. I will show you new truths by the transcendence of my art. I will create new meaning. Do you see what this does? And so in the arts now, that's why in the Romantic era, music and art and those sort of things becomes all about expression. Now, it's not initially that way. Like you look at a composer like Beethoven. Beethoven's kind of a classical and also romantic. So he's expressing himself, but he's still writing in old forms. Does that make sense? Brahms, Mendelssohn are like that, where they express themselves, but there's still limits to what they do. But as that goes on, it's like, I don't need rules of theory. I don't need rules of music. I'm just expressing myself. See? Because those conventions are stopping me. Those conventions are stopping me from being my authentic me. Now in pop culture, what that ends up being is I broke up with my girlfriend and I'm my guitar and I'm strumming and I'm emoting and I'm in my garage and man, people like my music, so therefore I should go tour. And that means I'm a good musician. Because it's all subjective experience. Okay, so that really impacts the arts. Ralph, what are we going to add to that? Yeah, go ahead.
You were saying it, and I was thinking the musical, whatever, jazz. I mean, if you look at modern jazz, go back 80 years after the time of what's his name, the pianist, black pianist that did ragtime. And it started,
Scott Joplin.
Yeah, Joplin. And it started progressing. You had the big band stuff, and it still had some formality, some structure. Then you get to Dizzy Gillespie and some of these things, and said, "What the heck is that?"
Yeah, it's free. It's called free jazz, right?
Myself.
Right. He's expressing himself. That's the key word.
Yeah.
The key word is expressive, and so what Truman calls this is expressive individualism. He puts these words together, and he gets this from one of the sociologists that he has. That we live in a culture of the psychologized self. In other words, how are you happy? You are happy by being true to yourself and expressing yourself. Happiness is found from within. Another example that he uses, and I think it's a great example of a shift culturally. If you would have asked his grandfather, "Are you happy in your work?" And he was a sheet metal fabricator. He worked in the industrial part of England. Think World War II era, right? So during the war, he may have been helping to put together airplanes. But before that, it was just housing or siding, and so that's what his job. His grandpa did. If you would have asked his grandfather, "Are you happy in your work?" He would have said, "Well, yeah, it lets me provide for my family. It allows my kids to go to school. It had nothing to do with, is the work fulfilling? He just did the work because of what it accomplished, right? So it was external for him. The meaning came from, this is my job, and this is what I do. Now when people say, "Are you finding meaning in your work?" You're like, yeah, when I'm at my job, I feel like I'm meant to be there. Now, that doesn't mean that's completely wrong, but the shift is important, because if you find your happiness in what you're doing outside of yourself versus finding your happiness within yourself, that makes a big difference. Now think about how this applies to an area like marriage. Think about how many divorces have happened, not because of adultery or because of abuse, and that's a whole nother ballgame. I'm talking about the marriages that have ended in divorce because, well, I just don't love you anymore, and to really be me and to live my true life, I need to leave you right now.
Yeah.
That's what that. Do you see how that? You see where this comes from? That's expressive individualism. Go for it.
No fault divorce.
Right. That's what no fault divorce is.
Right.
I just don't love you anymore. And so rather than saying that, even though right now it might be a difficult time, I've made this commitment, and because of virtue and honor and because of children or because of my commitment to society and stability, I'm still going to plow through, right, is the idea. Here, you need these. Hold on. Heads up. There we go. Look at that. You think we were married or something. All right.
One other thing, the
What?
no fault divorce, before that, you actually had to go to a judge and
Right.
plead your case, and he could refuse to grant you a divorce.
Right.
He would send you to a court of reconciliation.
So, but if you're an expressive individual, if that person is holding you back, it's perfectly legitimate for you to leave because, I guess that marriage is over now because I need to go express myself another way. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So that shift, so Truman goes through these shifts. So that's a really good example of that kind of authentic, so that authentic self. So now what happens, and this is, I'm going to show you a couple of books and I'm going to go to Isaiah. I just want to show you what's percolating in my brain because if I don't tell you now, I will go on this anyways, okay? So I need to get out of my system now because otherwise I'll get into Isaiah and then I'll get onto it anyway. So this way, at least it's somewhat organized, okay? All right. Because I'm telling you, this was I was having a hard time focusing yesterday. I was just like, my brain was just humming because of all this stuff, because it made a lot of sense and because I think this way. Okay, so let's just say you find your authentic you this way, right? Now, think about the sort of philosophers we get on the scene in the late 19th century. Think about people like Darwin or Marx or Freud or people like that. So now they show up and say that society is dominated by the bourgeoisie, right? The people of power, the people who hold the means of production, or the way we see this modern days, the cultural hegemon, the people that have, in other words, the people that rule the media, or the people that rule the schools, or the people that rule the government, or the people that dominate society, who dominate the conversation. So in the 20th century, that was identified as the following: white, cisgender, that means you identify with your actual biological sex, okay? Just if you don't know what that term means. You're white, cisgendered, male, heterosexual, able-bodied, Christian. That's the man that cultural Marxists have identified as the enemy. Okay, now think about this. If your expressive self, for example, is as a lesbian Buddhist, I'm just going to throw something out there, this stuff over here is keeping you down. So what's your job in society? To do everything in your power to take it out, because it's stopping you from being your authentic you. See how this works? So now you wonder why, for example, we police speech, because speech is power, and power dynamics are part of the system. And if that power speech, those figures of speech, keep the hegemon in his power, we need to take those figures of speech down. We can't misgender people.
No free speech.
Right. Well, because free speech is used by the hegemon to suppress those who are, you see this, who are not able to express themselves authentically. You see what's going on?
Yeah.
And so I'm telling you, if it's like, if you've ever watched The Matrix, it's like taking the pill, right? All of a sudden, like, this is one of those books that if you understand what's going on, it helps a ton to understand your cultural moment, your cultural zeitgeist, your cultural spirit of the times, okay? So this is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. I'm going to share my screen. And here's the book I'm referencing, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. And I'm telling you, this is hard. It's a slog to get through this. Now, there's going to be a condensed and simplified version that's coming up next year, okay? Because this has got some stuff. If I read some of the quotes from some of this, you'd be like, wow, this is pretty dense. We got to kind of talk about this for a while.
What got you on this book?
Okay, two things. One, a Lutheran pastor named Jordan Cooper, who's in our sister denomination, the American Association of Lutheran Churches. He talked about it and recommended it. Another way I got connected to this is the Colson Center for a Christian Worldview, Breakpoint, Prison Fellowship. They're so passionate about this that if you make a donation, they give it to you for free. I mean, they're saying they want as many people, you get what I'm saying, talking about this. A Roman Catholic reviewer on the magazine First Things recommended the book. So there was all these recommends coming down, and everybody kind of recommended it. And Grove City College, I admire for their commitment. So look at this. This is kind of interesting. You can see his little blurb here. It's going to let me there we go. Modern culture is obsessed with identity. Since the landmark Orangeville versus Hodges Supreme Court decision in 2015, that's what legalized same-sex marriage for all 50 states. And I should say legalized, really imposed it, said you have to recognize it, would be a better way of saying that. Sexual identity is dominated both public discourse and cultural trends, yet no historical phenomenon is its own cause. From Augustine to Marx, various views and perspectives have contributed to the modern understanding of the self. In this timely book, Carl Trueman analyzes the development of the sexual revolution as a symptom rather than the cause. That's one thing he says Christians make a mistake, is they look at, say, like the alphabet soup, and I'm just saying that because I don't know how many letters there are, but LGBTQ plus, et cetera, okay? Yeah. Okay, the letters keep expanding, okay? Because remember, you can create as many identities as you need to what everybody authentic you is. So I expect that number to increase. Because originally it was LG, then it was LGB, then it was LGBT, now it's LGBTQ plus, then it was LGBTQIA plus. Now is what we're at now, okay? So if you didn't know that, I means like you're either intersex or like you're inquiring, those sort of things. And A is asexual, that you're just nothing.
Then they've got I squared.
Yeah, and then right, exactly. And then the plus is, well, in case you feel left out, you're in the plus. Okay, so that's what that's for. But anyways, he's saying that Christians sometimes have made the mistake of going after some of that ideology, not recognizing that that's a symptom of a greater ideology. That's actually the latest fad or the most obvious expression of something that's a lot deeper than that. And so he goes through some of this. Now, of course, from a Christian worldview, we could say, sin's the root cause. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the answer to all of our problems in a sense, right? There's rebellion and there's brokenness. I mean, from a theological perspective, it's pretty easy in some ways. It's actually pretty simple. No matter how many theories we come out there, it's still sin, okay? So, I mean, so we can go through that, or it's still failure to meet God's standards. I mean, yes, so let's keep that in mind. But in our moment, to speak to the moment and understand the times, it's very helpful. And so this is on Christian Book. You can get it anywhere, Amazon, other places like this. You can get it for different views and different things. They got 2 reviews here, but I mean, it came out last year, and it's and it's going through all. You should know that lots of people are talking about this in kind of intellectual circles right now. And I'm telling you, I don't make strong recommendations a ton, but this one is extremely helpful for understanding why people think the way they do and why they talk the way they do. Because often, so for example, I'll give you a great example, and I do this with with my high school students. I do this. My high school students often, for example, on this decision that he mentions, the Supreme Court decision in 2015. Well, it's justice. Because after all, they were oppressed, and justice is allowing them to have the rights that everybody else has. So this act in 2015 is justice for homosexuals. It is just. And why? And so I said, so how, as a Christian, if you have a Christian worldview and you believe that God determines what justice is, how do you answer that? Because if it's all about your own personal rights and it's all about your own personal identity, and they were not allowed to express their identity and their true feelings, and after all, love is love, then that means that decision is justice. And it was a long time coming. You see how this works? So you've got to understand the arguments that are being made in order to address them. So on that issue, then, the question is one of identity. Who are you? Where did you come from? Where are you going? Those classic worldview questions. If you find the answer to those within yourself, and your entire society is constructed just popularly, people don't even think about this stuff. This is just common, people it's just part of what, this is actually in the book too. He calls it it's like called a cultural, I'm going to forget the second word. But the idea of it is it's your cultural psychology. In other words, people think a certain way without even really self-addressing. It's not like I sit here and think like, okay, what is my culture telling me right now?
Yeah, it's innate.
Right? It's just innate. Oh, it's the cultural imaginary. He calls it the cultural imaginary. So what the average person on the street assumes without even knowing they're assuming it, that's the cultural imaginary. So in our cultural imaginary, because we're so programmed to think in terms of individual rights and expression and all these other different things, when something like the Supreme Court decision comes down or something like bathroom access becomes a thing, the reason that's important to them and the reason they think it's an issue of justice is they think a certain way. Okay, so when we're talking to people like that, should we address the political issue at the moment, or do we try to get to the root problem, right? That's what he's asking. Because unfortunately, a lot of Christians have gotten distracted on the symptom rather than the cause. You get the argument that he's making? And so the symptom is things like, I'm going to dress like a woman, and if you don't recognize it, then you're a bigot. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a symptom. That is not the problem. They're able to do that and think that way because of something else. Do you see what I'm saying? And so he's asking that question. And that's why this is so valuable to me. Because I read a book like Isaiah. I'm going to give you a great example. And this is where I am, and I promise I'll tie this in. You read like Isaiah, and it talks about justice all the time. The book of Amos, in particular, is famous for talking about God's justice. God is just, okay? So as Christians, we should be concerned about justice. So now what happens is because of that cultural imaginary, we get programmed, you should be concerned about justice. God cares about the poor and the oppressed. God cares about those who, have had bad things happen to them in life. God is so concerned with justice that his own son goes to the cross. I mean, justice is a part of us. This is us. This is how we think, right? And so it's really sneaky because now we take these modern cultural imaginaries and say, well, this is justice. And then as a Christian, you feel bad without going along because, well, Jesus is just and Jesus is loving. And so I need to affirm this. Otherwise, I'm not being like Jesus. So you can understand how, and I'm going to use this word, and it's kind of intentional. It's not a complete pun, but it's kind of on purpose, how seductive this really is. Because it uses the same terms. And so I'm going to go to the next speaker. If you don't know this guy, and this is the other book that just came out that I also recommend, called Fault Lines, The Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looting Catastrophe. This could apply to anybody outside of evangelicals, but Voddie Baucham, I said his name right that time. Voddie Baucham, he's a huge black pastor. Came from South Central LA, played college football in 1989, played for Rice, played D1 football, scholarship athlete. So I think that gives you an idea. Grew up with a single mom who was a Buddhist. He had cousins killed in drive-by shootings. I mean, he would tell you that you can't tell me I'm not in touch with blackness. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, that's what he will tell you. You know what I mean? He lived that experience. And he absolutely rejects the idea of something called social justice. And here's why. He says that this comes from a specific, and this is where it's very similar to Truman's book. Truman is about why people function the way they do emotionally, psychologically, and how the culture thinks. He is giving you the idea of how these ideas are kind of have a very specific purpose and meaning in history, and also how it's poisoning cancer in the church. So Truman is more of so he's a little bit more polemical. You know what I mean? He's a little bit more take no prisoners. But he gives a talk at Patrick Henry College in January, and it's called this, Fault Lines. And Voddie Baucham, I'm telling you, this is probably one of the best ways of understanding how you get to the way we talk about things like politics and justice and agendas in the church. Because people, again, are seduced by this language because it sounds nice. It sounds Christian to say words like tolerance or to say words like justice or to say words like love, because yes, those are biblical terms. But he actually quotes Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride. He goes, he goes, you keep using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means. And he says there's way too many Christians that are using terms like social justice, and it doesn't mean what they think it means. That's the problem, is we're defining our terms differently. In our local neighborhood, we can appreciate that with our LDS neighbors, right? How they use the word atonement and the word Trinity to mean something different. When we say Trinity, we mean one God in three persons, not dividing the substances, not dividing, right? What the Father has, the Son has, what the Son has, there's one will, right? In the Trinity, there's one will, one God, three persons. We don't say that there are three separate beings that are united in purpose somehow. That's the LDS definition, but they'll still call it the Trinity, right? You get what I'm saying? We're defining our terms differently. So unfortunately, well-meaning Christians who try to seem like they're culturally relevant or to seem like they can speak to the moment will adopt some of the language, not knowing what they're doing. And that's kind of the point of this book. And he goes through some of the history of this and says, hey, look, the idea of quote unquote social justice comes from critical theory. Critical theory operates under Marxist categories of oppressor and oppressed. Concepts such as intersectionality, those sort of things. Have you ever heard those terms? He defines all those and then goes through and talks about why it's such a problem and such a poison in the church. Okay, this just came out. You can see the date. I think the date was here. Hard copy, April 6th. I mean, this is really recent. I've seen the talk. I've read portions of it. I can already tell you it's amazing. This one's easier to read. I will say that. So the Voddie Baucham book compared to the Truman book, if you want one that you can kind of get through quicker, this is it. Okay, and this really in particular explains our political and media discourse. So he goes, how did we get from, for example, global warming to climate change, now to climate justice? How did we get there? You see what I'm saying? He talks through those things. So in particular, so Truman's is broader. Truman's is more historical. Baucham's is a little bit more focused on like that specific idea of this justice and critical theory and where this is coming from. Together, if you kind of can distill those things, I'm telling you, it's like taking that pill in the Matrix where all of a sudden you realize what's going on. You actually get what's going on. So again, I'm full of it. I'm trying to figure out with my seniors this year. We got a small group of seniors. It's our smallest class. So if they end up watching this class, they'll know why. We're going to go through some of this with my seniors, I think, in May. I think we're going to just go through and say, okay, you're going to college. When somebody says to you something like, speak truth to power, what does that mean? Like, why do we use it? Isn't that a weird phrase? Speak truth to power, and then also speak your truth to power?
It's just saying truth.
Right. Why do we say it that way? The reason is because the hegemony, that it's all about power, right? And so when people speak and they use certain phrases and certain words, that's power. And so if you speak your truth to power, that allows you to express your authentic self and to create power for yourself. So it's not about objective truth. It's about your subjective experiences. And if you're part of one of the oppressed groups, those subjective experiences always carry more weight. Every time. What Voddie Baucham will say is like, look, if you're a white man, you're a Christian, you will never be able to apologize enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's why. Because even if you're not intentionally racist, even if you're not intentionally, you're right, those sort of things, you try to be kind to your neighbors, even if you try to be aware of some of the injustices in society, you will never be able to apologize enough because you still have benefited from privilege. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if your dad worked 60 hours a week to put bread on the table, or if you had a single mom and you lived in a trailer park, that experience does not matter. Does not matter because you're still part of the power structures. And the church some people in the church have bought into this and smuggled it into the church as if it's somehow part of the gospel or part of the way that God talks about justice. You get what I'm saying? And so this is a big one. So this book, along with the Truman book, I'm telling you. So I'm going to get to Isaiah here. And forgive me. I knew I was going to talk about this, so I just did it right away. Okay, I'm going to go to Isaiah in a second. Yeah, go ahead, Deb.
Okay, so there's a book also about progressive ministers. Would you say then?
Oh, that's Alyssa Childs.
Yeah.
That's a good book too. It's about the gospel, and this actually is an older one. So Alyssa Childs, if you don't know her book, this is a little bit more, I wouldn't say as philosophical. This is more kind of, it reads more like journalism. So what Alyssa Childs did is she says, so she was raised as a Christian fairly conservatively. And then when she got to like high school or college, she ran into some people that said, well, Jesus is about justice or Jesus is about love. And so he would be for example, the Occupy Wall Street people protesting, the building of a new carbon emitting building. What? And Jesus was before that. Why is that? So she was like, okay, this is weird. Or Jesus would be for gay marriage, or Jesus never talked. Like she ran into people like that. And it kind of confused her. And so she kind of went on this like investigation of like, why do people that are Christians here say it this way? And other people that claim to be Christians here say it this way. Where's this coming from? And so she goes into progressive Christian circles and goes and actually asks and tries to investigate where they're coming from. And she identifies some teachers that are really popular in these circles. In Lutheran circles, the most infamous is, now this is not Lutheran Church Missouri Synod because she would have been expelled. Okay, this is not in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. But in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, it's a lady named Nadia Boltz-Weber. I don't know if you've seen her. She's like all tatted up. She left her marriage because it was not sexually satisfying enough. And she calls herself a pastrix. Not joking. Okay. And she's, very popular in these sort of circles. She had one of the founders of the feminist movement. I'm not going to say it on the podcast too bluntly, but you guys are all adults. You'll appreciate this. She had one of the founders of the feminist movement. I can't remember if it was Gloria Steinem or somebody like that. And she gave she had purity. Do you remember when purity rings were a thing?
Yeah.
In the 90s?
Yeah.
So Nadia Boltz-Weber had them all melted down into a gigantic part of the female anatomy and gave them as a gift to Gloria Steinem. And she calls herself a Lutheran pastrix. Okay, what in the world's going on there? You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, there's a lot of really strange stuff. Truman and Bauckham will give you the framework for that. Alyssa Childs is more of just kind of like a what's going on, like on the ground. So it's like journalism. It reads more like journalism. Alyssa Childs' book.
But it's the same idea within this sort of thing, that the church has been infiltrated with the progressive sort of thought, and something it's all go together. And
so and again, defining terms is huge. I'm finding more and more, especially with students too. We're going all the way back to the ancient Greeks on this. With Socrates, what do we mean by these terms? So when we define words like progressive or liberal, what do we mean? Because like classical liberal means somebody devoted to individual rights and economic liberty. Right, that's classical liberty. Like somebody like John Locke or somebody like Adam Smith, that's a classical liberal, right? Now we use the word liberal as in somebody who wants to, for example, let people use the restroom. Okay, what do we mean by liberal? Same with conservative. What are we conserving? Right, you get what I'm saying? So I mean, those words can mean different things. What do we mean by libertarian? Do we mean we can just shoot up with any drug we want, or do we mean maximum? You know what I'm saying? So we have to define our terms with a lot of this. So like with progressive Christianity, she does a pretty good job expressing what she means by that. And she goes in. So like Bauckham and Truman, when these ideas get into the church specifically, what does it look like? And so she's, like I said, this is where it's more like journalism. So she gets into like people like, there's a guy named Richard Rohr, who's a Roman Catholic, and he's like a New Age guru. And she explains why he's so popular. You know what I mean? So she actually goes to specific modern teachers. These guys are more historical, like, kind of like getting us to the moment. She's a little bit more like kind of current events, like what are the most popular progressive teachers and who are they? And why are they popular in the church? That's Alyssa Childs. I can show really quick. And again, this is...
And she is on Zoe Girls. So I had girls. So Zoe Girls was a musical group.
Oh, okay.
She was one of the singers for Zoe Girls, if you've heard of it.
I Googled that Bodie Bauckham, millions of videos on him.
Oh, cool.
Oh, yeah.
Looks like he's preaching.
I gotta find, it might not be on here. I might have to look here. I'm pretty sure it's Alyssa Childs. Am I right about that?
It's Childers.
Childers, there we go. That's why I was right. Childers.
Her mom did cookbooks, I think.
That's Julia.
Yeah.
Funny. Here it is. This is it. Yes, this came out last year. And again, if you want lots of stuff to read, Another Gospel, a lifeline Christian seeks the truth in response to progressive Christianity. This is it. So you can see, I'll give you the synopsis here. There you go. A movement seeks to redefine Christianity. Some think that it's much needed progressive reformation. Others believe it's an attack on historic Christianity. Alyssa Childers never thought she would question her Christian faith. She was raised in a Christian home where she had seen her mom and dad feed the hungry, clothe the homeless, and love the outcast. She had witnessed God at work. And then she had dedicated her own life to leading worship as part of the popular Christian band Zoe Girl. There you go, which means life. Zoe means life in Greek, right?
Music's great. I love music.
All that was deeply challenged when she met a progressive pastor who called himself a hopeful agnostic who's a pastor. What's going on?
makes no sense.
So look what it says. Another gospel describes the intellectual journey Alyssa took over several years as she wrestled with a series of questions that struck at the core of the Christian faith. After everything she had ever believed about God, Jesus, and the Bible had been picked apart, she found herself at the brink of despair until God rescued her, helping her to rebuild her faith one solid brick at a time. In a culture of endless questions, you need solid answers. If you or someone you love has encountered the ideas of progressive Christianity and aren't sure how to respond, Alyssa's journey will show you how to determine and rest in what's unmistakably true. And then you can see Strobel there. This may be the most influential book you will read this year. That's The Case for Christ, Case for Miracles. He's the recommender. And so this is a good, if you want another one, this is, again, compared to the other two, if you want to talk about difficulty in reading, Truman's probably here, Bachman's probably here, Childers probably here. Doesn't mean that it's bad. I'm just telling you just in terms of reading level. You know, it's just, or if you're going to bed at night and you want to read a chapter, Truman's probably not for you, okay? Childers you can get through, okay? And I mean that positively. She wrote a book that's very accessible. I mean that positively. Yeah, go for it.
This whole certain idea of transcendent whatever shows just how wise our forefathers were, especially the one, and you know this, I can never remember who it was, and I have to paraphrase. He said basically our system of government is totally unsuited to a non-Christian nation. Or
it's for a moral people, right? Yeah,
for
exactly.
moral people.
Yes.
And you had a number of the founding fathers who were not by definition Christian, as we would say today, but they understood that truth is not transcendent. Truth is very static. Mm-hmm. And these men were all learned in Greek and many of them in Hebrew and Latin. They went to the greats and came up with the system, and the system has a solid base. You can't just shift it when it's uncomfortable. It stays there. It shows how wise they were to come up with this. Fast forward, even the best of intentions can be filled with holes. And we see this, since you could, basically this goes to your constitutional class, maybe with the Civil War, when 13 states decided they were a separate nation and didn't want to do, slavery was not originally part of it, as you know, became part of it. And they wanted to separate from the rest of the country. The rest of the country imposed its will on the 13, and I'm really melting it down. And we had a change in the philosophical bent of the Constitution, forced integration in the schools, where the governor, what is his name, stood in the doorway and said, segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. And the federal government, under LGB and Kennedy, said, no, you're going to do this anyway.
It's actually Eisenhower.
Yeah, Eisenhower, that's right. He was
Yes.
the precipitating movement on it. They got it done, but he was, and then coming to Obergefell or whatever it is. And here again, a small percentage of people decided they were loud enough and powerful enough, said, we want this. And once again, the Constitution took a back seat to transcendent thought or justice or identity.
Well, okay, so that's a whole, we'd have to spend a whole class unpacking everything you just said. But okay, so I can't get, obviously, especially with the podcast, I can't get too political, obviously, right?
No,
so
I was saying that
right,
your
yeah.
Constitution classes.
Right, with some of that, but I get what you can correct me. I think I get what you're trying to say, and that's that in the 1700s, when the Constitution was written, or when the Declaration was written, and actually the Declaration is probably an even better example, because the Constitution is a giant compromise, right? I think everybody recognizes that.
Yes.
Okay, so really the Declaration is probably a better idea in terms of what they were believing. You get what I'm saying? So if you want to go to that, you are correct in that back then they did find a sense of transcendent meaning, right? So that's why you read the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, everybody can see it. It's available via natural law, right? That all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator. Now, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams might have meant something different by the word creator, but they still meant creator, okay? With certain unalienable rights, meaning you can't take it away from them. It's built into their humanity. That is something that is not how we talk now. Okay, because the reason that is because it means it's part of you as a person, meaning when you were born, you had a nature. Okay, and that nature comes from just by being a member of the human race. Okay, even in the Enlightenment, they still believe there was a human nature. Okay, we're getting to the point now where you can create your own nature. That's the difference, right? Okay, so that's where I'm with you in the sense that if you have a moral people, so yeah, that, and then among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That comes from John Locke, Life, Liberty, and Property, right? It's John Locke's Treatises on Government, right? And so John Locke, and actually he's mentioned by Truman as somebody that's in this, because both he and Rousseau and Descartes and all these other philosophers were asking questions like, how do we know what we know? And they weren't trying to take out Christianity. They were more just trying to understand how society works, right? And then, but it laid the groundwork for some people to eventually say, well, we can just blow up the whole system, right, and get rid of everything. So that's an interesting comment. So yeah, now, so if you take a system that was built by people who believed in transcendent reality and who believed in a universal human nature and believed in universal human rights and believed in those things, take that system, but then populate it with people who deny that worldview. Yeah, you got a problem. That I agree. That's where I'm with you, because now you've got people that are in there and saying, well, no, you can just do whatever you want it to be. There's no such thing as universal human nature. You know, you can determine your own reality. 1993, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Anthony Kennedy literally said in a court decision, and you know that it's, and I'm going to paraphrase, but you can look this up, something along the lines of, incumbent upon all Americans is the right to determine one's own meaning for himself. He says it in 1993 in a court decision. And so I tell my government kids this all the time. This is not a political statement. I was like, think about how ironic that is coming from a judge. Well, my reality says I can ignore your decision.
Yeah.
I mean, that's got to be one of the that's one of the most ironic. How does that become the force of law? Because now law is completely arbitrary. So I mean, to say that in a Supreme Court, it's one thing to have that personal opinion, but to actually put that as the majority opinion. This is 1993. We've shifted now. This is not objective law. This is about internalized happiness. Okay, the abortion issue falls right into some of this stuff, because this baby is preventing me from living my best life now. This baby is an unexpected burden. This baby, so we need to find a clinical, safe, legal way of getting rid of this so that I can be my authentic me. See how that you see how that same reasoning can flow? You see what I mean? Yeah, go for it.
That kind of falls apart when they're doing this stuff here, because in Roe v. Wade, the woman supposedly pushing the issue here wanted universal abortion. Simplifying it. Years later, she changed her mind.
Oh, yeah.
Whoa, wait a minute. Is that a new personal reality or what?
Right. She has a weird, and then when she died, she kind of backtracked again. It was weird. She had a kind of strange. Okay. Of course, I didn't even get to Isaiah. All right. Of course not. It's okay. So forgive me online if you were hoping to get to Isaiah 47, 48. I guess I'll just hold up because that was the bell and I need people to get to church. But forgive me. It was a four-way and I got distracted. But I wanted to just bring this up to you because I think it's here. Okay. I'll say this. As a deacon, as an elder, and as a teacher of young people, let's just say it this way. Okay. So I sometimes am able to preach. I sit on board meetings. I sometimes work with people at ISU. I got high school students here. I'm online all the time. So, I mean, as somebody who's kind of plugged in culturally and who has some teaching authority, I think it's important that Christians, we need people who understand the times. Yes. Because when your grandkids or your kids say, Mom, Dad, why is this happening? Or Mom, I have a friend at school, or you know, Grandpa, I have a friend at school who thinks she's a boy. How do you answer that? Especially when they're older. I mean, yeah, when they're 8 years old, kids go through phases all the time when they're 6 to 8 years old. That's always been recognized, right? Gender dysphoria, that's a category that's always existed. Okay. It's usually boys between the age of 4 and 6, actual gender dysphoria. That's an actual clinically diagnosed thing that's been known for hundreds of years. Okay?
It's considered temporary.
Yeah, it's temporary, and yeah, 90 something % of them get over it within a year. I mean, it's really right, that sort of thing. Regardless. If you have a kid that asks you these things, or if they go to college and they come home with some of these ideas, or you have you get what I'm saying? Do you have an answer? Can you address them? Can you actually say, oh, hey, this is why your professor sounds like that? Or, hey, here's why the Christian worldview is not compatible with that. Or how can you answer your professor? Or how's your faith now? And I think the way Pastor Dinger put it, we talked in the office between Easter services last week. And Pastor Dinger said, if you go to college with an 8-year-old's faith, you will die. Your faith will die. If all you know is Jesus loves me, and then you go to college and you hear this stuff.
You don't just hear it, you get it.
Oh, yeah.
Thrown down your throat. Yeah.
How's your faith? You know, so that's why, and so forgive me, again, a little bit of a foray, and my kids are coming in. I told you I had a limit here. So I promise next week, now that I got it off my chest, I promise next week we'll do 2 chapters in Isaiah. And then my plan is once we get through Isaiah, and it's good that we get into the Word of God because that's our foundation. But once we get through Isaiah, I am going to talk to Pastor about this. But I think I'm going to do an Understanding the Times class. I think we're gonna go and actually use the Truman, his 20-minute things, and just go bit by bit and just go through this. And you look at current events, look at what our synod says, look what the Bible says, look what our confessions say, and just do a real strong understanding the times, because that's where my heart is. I think you're hearing that. That's where my passion is, and I think it would be helpful for you, and I think it would I hope, bless you and also give you a sense of hope, because these things are going to burn themselves out. And then the question is what's left, right? And so how can you, so in somebody that's a refugee from some of this thinking, or a refugee from, you know, the abuses at college, or, you know, they've lived in some of these lifestyles, you know, how can you speak to them understanding where they're coming from and how they are now a refugee or a victim of some of these ideologies? You know, because there will be victims. There will be people that are burned by this. Okay, go ahead, Jerry, and then Ralph, and then I got to get these kids going. Yeah, what's up?
So, comment, you know, some of this stuff that we're talking about, it's coming to the church in more subtle ways.
Oh, yeah.
So that from Philippians 2, have the same mind in you that was in Christ. That's, you know, there's issues that come up, all kinds of things, that I don't think people don't like. You know, they don't think about, oh, well, how, you know, Christ emptied himself, you know, gave up his rights, you know, and Paul, the Apostle Paul, there were times, you know, when he pulled out his Roman passport, and there were times that he didn't.
Right, exactly.
And there's, but I think Christians, you know, there are times when I think Christians need to, you know, put aside their, American citizenship, you know, whatever it is, you know, they need to.
Yeah, there's no such thing. One of the things that you're absolutely, I'm not trying to interrupt, but you're absolutely, I want to emphasize this, and it's important we know this. There's no such thing as the American church. There's just a church. Yeah. There's no such thing as, right? There's no such thing as the Russian church. I mean, I know what we mean by that when we say it. We mean the geographic locale because it's a specific experience. I know we don't mean anything malicious about it.
Yeah.
But you're right that before that, your identity first is in Christ. You are a dual citizen, right? That's the doctrine of two kingdoms. You're a citizen of heaven and you're a citizen of this world. One of those is priority, right? One of those is priority. Your identity in Christ is first. It is not secondary. And they're not the same either. That's another problem that we sometimes do. We kind of mix them, right? That's the other one. So no, I think it's a good comment.
Put it this way, you know, not putting a stumbling, you know,
right.
Being intentional about not putting a stumbling block.
Right. Absolutely. I'm with you 100%.
And I think that, you know, these things have crept into the church. And so people think, oh, I shouldn't worry about having to be a stumbling block for someone because I'm, you know, what I think is.
I'm a good person.
You know, I'm a good person. I'm
being loving. I'm being accepting. Right.
Yeah. You know, that type of thing is important. But yet there are things that we do or we advocate for that is putting a stumbling block.
Yeah, path. It's true. If you're denying truth for the sake of love, we've got a problem, because love and truth do not contradict. Yeah. But unfortunately, that's kind of you're right. It does creep in much more subtle ways. I'm with you. It took me a while to figure out where you were going with it, but I got you. I'm with you because it does. It's very subtle. It's kind of like what do I say in some other, you know, it's the whole road to hell is paved with good intentions thing, right? Your intentions are noble. Your intentions are good. You're wanting to help people. You want to love for people, but then you're kind of letting those little things come in. So no, I'm with you. What were you going to say, Ralph? And then I know we need to go.
Your class is telling me, if you look in the paper today, there's a fellow going to be speaking at ISU who calls himself, I probably got it messed up, a theological atheist.
Oh, I saw it advertised already. Yeah. I saw it advertised. It was put in I think the psychology department was advertised. Yeah, I did. Oh, well, we're done anyways.